Hi, I'm Dan Kubisky, co-chair of the SPJ International Community. And with me today, we're very fortunate to have Jessica Jerreat, who is the press freedom editor for Voice of America. She's currently in Uruguay for a conference on journalism under digital siege, sponsored by the UNESCO. So Jessica, thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule. And what's your takeaway from the event so far?
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate you having VOA back on with the SPJ again. We're in Uruguay for the UNESCO annual World Press Freedom Day conference. Each year it's a combination of sort of academic research, but also hearing from key people, journalists and researchers who are involved in the challenges facing media. This year we have a real focus on the sort of digital threats that we're seeing. There have been a lot of really engaging panels on the impact of Pegasus surveillance software, for instance, that we saw a lot last year with just globally this NSO surveillance software that is being put onto the phones, government bought software put on the phones of journalists and activists. This morning, there was a panel with the El Salvadorian news group, El Faro, this investigative news group, who found, I think, like 22 of their journalists had this software on their phone, and they've been going through and tracking sort of hostile government rhetoric that matched around the times that their phones were being surveilled. But unlike most cases with Pegasus, where it comes onto a journalist's phone for just a few days, they had 7 months of really intense surveillance put onto their phones and their digital sort of communication devices. So really sort of talking about the impact of trying to work in this very sort of hostile environment, knowing that you're essentially that somebody is listening in and putting your sources at risk. Another side that's been particularly big at the conference this year is really looking at furthering the research into digital harassment of female journalists. There've been some really interesting. Yesterday on May 3rd, we had the main special rapporteurs for the United Nations, Irene Khan, Teresa Ribeiro, and others, explaining why online attacks are so damaging to women's voices and how it's this sort of silencing effect that it has. And they sort of have reiterated their calls that this has got to be more than just governments and the social media companies trying to address this, but there needs to be more coming from newsrooms themselves, helping their journalists understand the threats, helping them respond to them, and just trying to sort of deal with that. In a side panel to that, there was a brilliant young former journalist from South Africa who studied the very sort of specific cultural, the way that these online attacks on women come down to this very sort of specific local level. So she was sort of talking about this history of racism and violence directed at women already in South Africa, and how that background just really makes a hostile attack or this sort of mob violence that you see on digital media have just a greater risk that it might spill over into something bigger. And I thought it was quite an interesting way she did a study looking at the social media accounts of 6 sort of leading female news anchors and journalists, people who cover politics and current affairs, the issues that quite often trigger these attacks. But she picked a time period where there was nothing really big in the news. There were no elections. This was sort of like all the heat taken out of the moment, but still the sort of vitriol that comes out on social media and directed at these journalists. It just sort of makes no sense to a reasonable thinking person, like why you would want to try to shut someone down and in such a sort of belittling, demeaning manner. And I don't know, I feel like that's sort of been a big theme this year at the conference, of just the drowning out of credible voices, either the drowning out through sort of women and minorities, or with the RSF report about Borders report yesterday, the expansive sort of disinformation that's drowning out credible news and public interest journalism. And I think that's going to be like a really big issue coming up in the next year, and trying to figure out what the solution is there to try to push all the disinformation aside and let these independent journalists, these independent voices come through.
Right. I want to return to the harassment of female journalists, because we've done a few programs on that ourselves. In the discussions that you had at these panels, did they single out any geographic area, or is this, as many of us think, is this truly a global problem?
I think, unfortunately, it's really a global problem. What's been interesting listening to the speakers here in Uruguay is the way that the harassment works at a local level. So, like, you've got the broad theme that this, like, digital harassment is predominantly focused on women and shutting down women's voices and silencing, you know, that whole side of society, belittling them. But the way that the threats are geared to specific countries, it's very specific to that sort of culture and built into the sort of specific threat environment. And I find that that might go some way towards finding the solution to addressing that. But we've had some interesting speakers who looked at sort of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, South Africa, and in the Americas, just showing how sort of like a culture of misogyny or existing violence already exists, and sort of this is where the sort of online harassment sort of festers in and makes it more of a problem, in terms of you can't just brush it off, you can't just ignore what's happening, because there is this very real risk that in that environment that already has perhaps a sort of tendency towards violence to women, but sort of, you know, like perhaps doesn't have like the best record for protecting the safety of women, how that becomes such a vital part of that conversation, that if the harassment is taking place in those countries.
And when the theme is digital, under digital siege, but let's face it, the violence against female journalists is not only digital. Did they address the whole range of threats to female journalists, and, well, let's face it, you know, to journalists in general?
Honestly, I think they probably did have some, on the sessions that I've been in, it's been mostly focused on the sort of online threat, but with always it could always sort of spill over into real world violence. But it has been, like I say, there's a lot of sessions here. It's really, I think all of them are available online. So I have like a whole secondary list of things I want to go back and re-listen to, but it has been very much sort of focused on the online environment and what's driving that and what we can do. There's sort of a secondary side of that with there's an academic conference that fits within this UNESCO Press Freedom Conference. And that's particularly interesting, looking at researchers and sort of stakeholders, to use their jargon, who are trying to find the solutions. And one of those is a group who are, just trying to remember their name of them now, the Journalism, Education and Trauma Research Group. And they're really working to try to provide the resources to both look into the impacts of the threats to journalism and what, like, the secondary trauma that journalists go through, trying to sort of build up that resiliency, but really through speaking to journalists as well, giving them a space to talk about what they're sort of going through and their experiences, and then trying to match that up with how newsrooms can better react, how they can sort of build in resiliency, help build out risk assessments with their journalists to really help them respond to this changing landscape that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. I mean, the risk assessment is becoming a growth, unfortunately, is becoming a growth industry for journalists and journalist organizations. One of the topics was, I noticed also, was censorship in a digital age. We're seeing, I mean, let's say, you know, UNESCO is a United Nations organization, and there are people, there are countries represented within the United Nations and within UNESCO who are not exactly friendly to free and independent journalism. How are they approaching these issues, such as censorship in a digital age, threats to female journalists, and all the other items we would put together as important to protecting press freedom. How are they putting this all together and still keeping peace in the family, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question. There seems to be a few sort of catchphrases of reminding everyone of, like, there's a standard that we're meant to be all adhering to, and that we need to be promoting that these are rights, these are protections that should be available in all of the member states. From the people at UNESCO, that sort of seems to be like the line that we all just need to be doing our part. From the panelists, I think we get a very much sort of real world experience of what it's like to maybe live in one of those countries where they're not upholding that side. I just came out of a session on press freedom solidarity. There's an activist, Nathan Law, who's just talking about what's been happening in Hong Kong and this steep decline, and just how quickly they realize that if they can make an example out of Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily, by arresting him, then others are going to immediately be a little bit more cautious about speaking truth, about reporting independently, and really just sort of spoke about the chilling effect that's having, not just on the local media where we've seen news outlets close down, but also on foreign media who are trying to see where that line is now and maybe moving teams out. And also with the Russia invasion of Ukraine, there's been some very powerful sessions with Ukrainian journalists as well, talking about what happens when, you know, Russia ramps up its disinformation, makes it incredibly hostile for any journalist to work, and then you have these local journalists who've all just found themselves suddenly war correspondents just by waking up in a war zone in their own country.
The Hong Kong obviously is something that we've been watching very closely, especially the most recent action by the Foreign Correspondents Club to suspend its human rights press awards. There are a lot of us who lived and worked in Hong Kong over the years who are very disappointed, but at the same time, we understand the pressure that the foreign correspondents are under. I don't want to take you much longer from these meetings. I know how these kind of conferences can be just so exciting, and you really hate to take yourself away from these. So is there any last thoughts or any ideas that you'd like to put forward that we haven't talked about in this very short, brief get-together?
Sure, I think, this is something that I always find is particularly interesting, is the solidarity aspect. I mean, one, just having journalists after like 2 years of a pandemic, just everyone gathered and being able to, like, all the conversations you can have outside of the panels as well, just meeting and being able to hear from colleagues about their different experiences and their solutions. But there's been a lot of talk, like the Forbidden Stories Safe Box Network, just talking about how they're working and collaborating, and there's sort of strength in numbers. It's easier to take on these big stories, just in terms of resources, but also in protection when you're taking on corruption or organized crime. And just the amount of research going into, I think that press freedom and journalist safety is really becoming a hot topic at the moment, and there's a lot more resources going into it. There's a lot of I will pause for a minute. Sorry. The benefits of being back in the real world again. You can't control your environment. So there's a lot of sort of solidarity, a lot of solutions, but particularly from the research field, which I think is just really important, because it's hard as journalists. We're very much sort of alone in trying to sort of, as an industry, navigate this. But there's a real ramping up of research, looking into everything from making sure there's good funding models to sustainability, to understanding surveillance, the threats of surveillance, and how we can push back against that. And as I mentioned earlier about the trauma and resiliency support that we need to give to journalists. There's been a lot of talk about how you help, the Afghan journalists who have gone into exile, that you don't want to lose John Williams is the head of RTE Ireland public broadcaster, was talking about how Ireland took in a lot of Afghan exiles, but how you don't want to waste that talent. These are experienced journalists that you don't want them, as he said, you don't want them to all just be Uber drivers in New York. we need to be able to sort of help support them and get them back into newsrooms. So I feel like there's a sort of lot of ideas and sense of solidarity and sort of compassion towards journalists about how we can make sure that people still have this environment to be able to work in increasingly tough sort of countries at the moment.
Right. Yeah. Again, the topics that, there's so many topics at this conference, and I wish I could be there. I mean, not only just because I haven't been to Uruguay, but also because it's such an exciting thing. I hope that maybe when you come back to the States, we could talk again and do a wrap up of the conference, maybe without so much noise in the background.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I would welcome that. Yeah, somewhere quieter, but of course, anytime it's always good to work with SPJ.
All right, Jessica, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it, and be safe and enjoy the conference.
Thank you so much.